How should this industry learn from what's been going on at Paris? Matthew.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And indeed, the Paris becomes very relevant when we start to talk about the types of timescales that Amanda was just mentioning. And so we think about one of the perhaps less advertised but most important parts of Paris was setting out an ambition for the second half of this century, saying that some point between 2050 and 2100, the world should be carbon neutral. And so any sources of new carbon into the air, into the seas, into the soil need to be balanced by sinks of new carbon. And the construction industry will play a crucial role on both of those sides of the fence, both in terms of minimizing new sources of carbon, as well as through its supply chain, through cement, through other aggregates that it uses, creating sinks for carbon and ensuring that infrastructure delivers the kinds of urban environments that Amanda was talking about and that we need for the second half of the century. Furthermore, as we heard, you can say that we want to balance net zero carbon by the second half of the century, and it sounds very far away. Having said that, 2050 is only 35 years away. We were just hearing about Crossrail and about when it's going to deliver. Most of the infrastructure that is being built today will actually be online and be delivering what it needs to deliver in the second half of the century, and it needs to be adapted and delivering for the world that will exist there. And ultimately, we're going to drive value through infrastructure by making sure it is suitable for the world that will exist between 2050 and 2100, rather than for the world as it did exist back in 1950. It was interesting, again, we saw and we heard mention of earlier the Infrastructure Commission's first report. In their first report, they defined the central ambition, the central challenge for infrastructure in the context that they were talking about as to modernize and to decarbonize. And those are the two challenges for infrastructure: to modernize the world we live in and to decarbonize it. And in that respect, the other interesting part of the report, and about lots of the thinking coming out of the Infrastructure Commission and coming out more widely, is what is the balance of big projects versus disaggregated, decentralized, resilient solutions that are going to be adapted to the world that we're going to live in the second half of the century. And for every project, asking ourselves, is the big mega project the answer, or is the more resilient and more consumer-friendly project that's going to be fit for the world that's going to exist in the second half of the century, one that is more decentralized and more linked to people's world and people's everyday lives? And so we see now the shift that is taking place, the shift that comes from something like Paris, setting out a vision and a goal for the whole world to work towards over a time scale that is relevant for infrastructure decisions. And we start to see the UK government and British policy developing and adapting to that world. And so the Committee on Climate Change, that is the independent body that I lead, responsible for advising Parliament and responsible for advising the government on what the next steps are to keep the UK on track to that 2050 and beyond target. And in particular, one of our central roles is to set what are called the carbon budgets for the UK. And the carbon budgets set out the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that the UK is allowed to produce over a 5-year period. So we've got carbon budgets set out now to 2027, and the government is currently in the process of legislating what's called the 5th carbon budget, which takes us out to 2030. On the timescales, carbon budgets set on the types of timescales that are relevant for infrastructure. And so we know as a country what we're aiming for in around that 2030 period for total aggregate emissions. And from those high-level targets, from that high-level ambition, which every government, historic governments and future governments, are then bound by the legal duties to meet those carbon budgets, every government then has to put in place policies that are consistent with meeting those carbon budgets, whether they're policies in the power sector and bringing emissions down in the power sector through a whole combination of low carbon power. Everything from huge construction projects, we hear lots of debate about nuclear and smart networks and smart grids, all the way down to solar projects and decentralized power. And similarly on the transport side, where you see huge projects like rolling out charging infrastructure and intelligent highways and ways of making sure that low emission vehicles can power themselves around the country, to the more decentralized solutions and autonomous vehicles and electric and hydrogen vehicles that are increasingly coming onto stream. And you see that in every sector of the economy. And boiling that down then to very micro level policies. And increasingly, as some of you will know, the government has shifted the focus for its advice on construction in part to what's called now the Construction Leadership Council, and making sure that the people in this conference and the new guys out there are able to feed through to the Construction Leadership Council what the vision should be for construction going forward, so that the advice that it provides to government in terms of public sector procurement, in terms of how to drive some of the skills that Amanda was talking about and some of the supply chain issues that we know exist, the Construction Leadership Council can make sure that the construction is focused on delivering that world in the second half of the 21st century. And at an even more granular level, we have a new standard coming out for the construction industry, the new PAS 2080 standard that's being launched by BIS and by a range of construction companies in March in this month, which will set out the world's first low-carbon infrastructure specification for the construction sector. It will set out, and it does set out, standard practice about how to measure and how to reduce carbon in construction and in infrastructure. And so we'll have a new standard for the sector that will help to drive innovation and drive new productivity through the construction industry. So all of this, the vision that comes from Paris, the work that's going on around the world, the fact that China, India, the United States, the UK, Europe, everybody, 190 odd countries signing up to that Paris Agreement to drive the carbon neutral world in the second half of the century, filtering down to the carbon budgets and the action that the UK will take, down to construction standards and standards for infrastructure and visions for infrastructure for the UK, all effectively in an effort to try to decouple what has up until recently been very closely coupled, to decouple economic growth from greenhouse gas emissions. And so we've seen since 1990 in the UK, greenhouse gas emissions have fallen by 36% relative to 1990 levels, whilst GDP has grown by over 90%, by over 60%. In the most recent year that we have data for, 2014, we saw economic growth of 2.8%. We saw manufacturing growth, of which construction is a big part, of around 3%, whilst we also saw emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, falling by about 8%. That combination of economic growth with falling greenhouse gas emissions is the type of thing that infrastructure and infrastructure investment will have to increasingly drive if we're going to meet the world that the Paris Agreement and that countries around the world are increasingly pushing forwards in the post-2050 era. I'll end there, Anthony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you. Quick question, though. Is this government good for a low-carbon future?
This government has said that by the end of this year, they are going to set out their carbon plan. And their carbon plan will describe the detail of how they're going to meet the carbon budgets that I was talking about. The carbon budget, which means that by the middle of the 2020s, we have to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions by about 52% relative to 1990 levels. We've already done 36%. And by 2030, we have to decrease our emissions by 57%. We know that by 2020, we'll have decreased emissions by about 43, 45%. So the challenge through the 2020s is to add a further 10 percentage points to that. The government has committed by the end of this year to setting out how it is going to do that, what the measures are that it are going to do. And hopefully it's hearing from everybody in this conference and people more widely about what should be in that plan in order to drive the emissions reductions that we need to have.
Because the key thing, key thing is actually getting people to understand that low carbon is actually a low cost option as well, presumably.
That's very closely linked, and the reason that the new PAS 2080 standard that I mentioned is being created is precisely because of that link between low cost and low carbon. And the fact that if you make savings on materials, if you use materials intelligently, if you build highways so that they don't have to be resurfaced every 10 years, but they can last for longer periods of time, and similarly with other infrastructure, then you reduce carbon alongside reducing cost.
Yannick, he's from University of Leeds. We did a wee bit of work for one of your reports on the embodied carbon associated with the National Infrastructure Plan. I'm interested, it's probably an unpopular question, but in the long term where you're talking about a net zero second half of the century and the level of infrastructure assets we can maintain in that, it's all very well saying we'll have zero emission vehicles by then, but you probably won't have zero emission roads. Do you think at some point in the, and if so, when, we need to start having a conversation about what level of assets you can maintain in that kind of carbon space? Because I don't see any mention of that at the moment, and I'm fully accepting that that's maybe a bit early for the industry, but I'm wondering at what point you think that conversation has to begin.
Well, I think we need to begin that now, and we need to begin it with the type of research and development and innovation that's going to be required to deliver that world post-2050. Clearly, net zero carbon doesn't mean no carbon emissions. It means that whatever carbon emissions there are have to be balanced by sinks for carbon, to absorb carbon. And that's going back to the beginning of what I said, where the construction industry has a big opportunity, not just to limit the amount of greenhouse gases that it's putting into the atmosphere, but to participate in what will be an increasingly lucrative market in how do you draw it out of, how do you create sinks for carbon, how do you make sure that cement and other aggregates are locking in the carbon that we want to lock in, because we know that there will still be, whether it's from agriculture or from certain bits of industry that are hard to decarbonize, we know there will be some emissions, and creating sinks, which traditionally have been trees, and which could be carbon capture and storage, but equally could be new aggregates and new construction products. Creating sinks will add new value, create new markets, because people will pay to store the carbon as part of the world that we're moving towards in the second half of the century.
Matthew, thank you very much. We have to leave it there. We're banging out of time, so thank you very much, Matthew. Round of applause, Matthew Bell.
Thank you very much.